Hey everybody, this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries, and we are here for another exciting interview today. I'd like to welcome Jason Owen to the broadcast. Jason, how you doing today?
I'm good, Joe. How are you?
I'm doing good. I'm excited for our talk and for our interview. We've been talking about it a lot behind the scenes, and this is going to be a good
hmm
one today. So, Jason, to introduce you to the audience, you are a Navy chaplain, a pastor, and a podcaster, and a fellow lover of what we call the strange parts of the Bible. So, maybe before we get into the actual questions, you can just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, absolutely. I am into all the weird stuff in the Bible. It's been really a lot of fun talking with you about these things offline, and it's fun to finally get together in this context and just talk about it, and put that word out. But yeah, I'm Jason. I'm a Navy chaplain, and I have to say, right, that everything that I share is my opinion, and it's not necessarily reflective of the Navy, the Navy Chaplain Corps, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. Even though I wish it was, Jesus is King, and I'm all about Him, as you are. So I'm grateful to be here today.
Right. That's perfect. So today we are going to be talking about the antediluvian world and the Nephilim. So those are kind of the two topics we're talking about. The antediluvian world, that is referring to the pre-flood world, the world that existed before the great flood, what's commonly called the great flood of Noah. We know the story from Sunday school of Noah's Ark. And we today are going to try to highlight some aspects of it that is believed by many people in the Christian church, but there are also many people in the Christian church who don't necessarily believe in some of the things we're going to emphasize today. So the goal is just going to be to paint some perspectives of some pretty cool things in scripture that really change the way that you read not only the first few chapters of your Bible, but really the whole Old Testament and even into the New Testament. So this is going to be exciting. So Jason, really to start today, we're going to be talking about Genesis chapter 6. And we know that when you read that chapter, it talks about how there was this group of angels, this group of Elohim who came down to the earth and they cohabitated with human women, and all this crazy stuff ensued from then. It resulted in this race of giants we call the Nephilim. So just to start out, why don't you just tell us a little bit about that, give us some perspective, and just get our conversation going today.
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of my favorite subjects, right? So Genesis 6. It appears to me that the recipients, like the original recipients of Genesis chapter 6, that they had the background. They already had the background story, because the author, he really doesn't elaborate much on what was happening exactly. So I think it's safe to presume that the people who received that first book, Genesis, already knew what he was talking about. And I think they knew either by oral tradition or by other texts like First Enoch exactly what was happening at that time. So what we learn from First Enoch is that 200 celestial beings, call them angels or watchers, banded together. They saw the daughters of men, human women, that they were beautiful. They took them as wives for themselves. But, that's after descending atop Mount Hermon. And they took these women for themselves. They did that, I think, either by force, their good looks, or their sheer power, or all of the above. We're not told exactly how they do that, but they take them. And then their offspring are these Nephilim, which means the giants or fallen ones. And I personally think this was part of the serpent's rebellion that started in Genesis chapter 3, tempting the first two humans to partake of that knowledge of good and evil. And did God really say, it's like you're missing out on something. And these two curious human beings took that serpent's word for it and partook of that. And now we were eaten out of house and home, so here we are.
Right.
So, yeah, I think the goal was to circumvent Yahweh's plan to, his promise, really, which was that the woman's seed would crush the head of the serpent's seed.
Yeah, and that's a really important part of this narrative, because we got these fallen angels, and there was this, whenever it happened, we have this big angelic rebellion, and we know that the serpent comes and tempts Adam and Eve, like you just said. And then there's this prophecy of the serpent's destruction, and by implication of the entire angelic rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
And when it says that it comes from the seed of the woman, it means that there's going to be someone born of a woman, so a human being. We know this is referring to Jesus Christ, and that this prophecy is what's going to usher in their defeat. So they know that, well, hey, wait a minute, if we can completely take over humanity or corrupt humanity genetically, or just mess up the human race in whatever way they were going to do it, we can stop this.
Yeah.
And I think that was, I mean, how they knew how it was all going to play out from the beginning, I don't know, but it seems like that was their plan in one shape or form before they even came to the earth. That seems to be what they were really one of their big aims of what they were trying to get at.
I agree with you. Some even in the blurry space, refer to that as the seed wars, just as you noted, this genetic assault to prevent the Messiah from coming. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, theologians debate, you got the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. I think it can be true in a very literal genetic sense and also in a spiritual sense. We know that Christians or believers are children of God, and we know everybody who is not saved is children of Satan. So it's certainly true in that sense, but I think it's also true in the parity between the humans and the non-humans rebelling against God. I think those are both true at the same time, in my opinion.
I think you're right. The genetic assault, that attack was against humans. There are folks out there too that kind of talk about the serpent seed, and there are actual human beings who live in this fear and dread, like maybe I have this Nephilim DNA and I'm doomed forever because I'm not entirely human. And I don't think that's a really wise way to go. And I'm not implying at all that that's what you're saying. It's just it's messy, it's complicated, but it's also wonderful because this seed, the fact that God became human to redeem us is really what the story is all about.
Yeah, for sure. It's really cool. It's amazing to me. I'll say this one last thing, then we can go to the next question.
Yeah.
But it's amazing that when you get into this story in the book of Genesis, and then also in extra biblical works like the Book of Enoch, how it's talking about how they were messing with things, what we would now call genetically. And you think about it, we didn't really have a real scientific understanding of genetics until pretty recently in our history.
Right.
I mean, we don't know what they understood of it in the pre-flood world, but it's amazing how this stuff was getting talked about in these texts from way back then. And now we're getting to a point in history where it comes into context. It actually is making sense for us, which is, I think it really authenticates a lot of this story.
You're right. I agree.
Yeah. So that's great. That's a great introduction. So we're just going to cover these three aspects. We got the angels, the watchers, we got the Nephilim, and then we have how it affects humans. We're just going to walk through kind of the different aspects of this story. So we know that this fallen group of angels that comes to the earth, they're called the watchers. And we know that in the Bible, it actually refers to them in certain places as lowercase g gods. That's how it usually shows up in our English translations, which is appropriate. We know that there's only the one true creator God that we're supposed to worship.
Mm-hmm.
But then we have this really weird aspect. I think there's a lot of stuff about angels that we really don't understand. So maybe you can give some perspective on some of this quote weird stuff to the listeners and kind of paint this picture. And you can also, could you please tell us a little bit about what's been called the divine council by guys like Heiser?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll do my best.
That's a lot to unpack.
Well, yeah, you mentioned Heiser, and folks like Dr. Michael Heiser, obviously way smarter than me. So you get the Jason Owen version, but much of what I've learned has been from folks like Dr. Heiser, and go back to Chuck Missler, and they will all say that the things we're talking about today, it's not new. This is nothing new. This is just, if we take the Bible just at face value, these are the things that we discover. So the gods, right? The Elohim as you know, El being God and the Eim at the end of any Hebrew, that's just noting the plurality. So the Elohim, simply put it, are really the gods. That just means that they're celestial beings. And learning this, it broke my paradigm, because I'm so learned to believe that as a monotheist, that there's one God, and for us, as Paul noted, there are many lords and many gods, and yet for us there is one God who's unlike any other. But they're also called the Watchers, right? And sometimes they're referred to as the Holy Ones. They're Watchers because they watch over the affairs of mankind, and they're Holy Ones because they had backstage access, if you will, to the throne of God. And we see these watchers in the scriptures, for example, in Daniel, right, chapter 4 and verses 13, 17, and 23, for example. And I'm referring to my notes. Thank you for giving me these questions ahead of time, because I don't want to forget these things. But they declared their collective decision to humble King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And this was a 7-year period, it would turn out, where he absolutely was humbled, and really at the end of that experience declared the Most High God, Yahweh, to be unlike any of the other gods he had known or worshipped beforehand. And so the Watchers are part of this divine council, right? This is in the court of the Most High God. And when you think about a divine council, it's not that Yahweh needs a council. He doesn't. Right. But it seems very clear that he wants that council. And the question we have to ask is, like, why would he want that council? And I think it's similar to why he would want to love human beings. Like in Ephesians, he says he does that really out of the good pleasure of his will. It seems to me he values the interaction and perspective of his celestial sons, which is amazing, right? When the divine council functions perfectly, the Most High's will is carried out, and everything is good. His name is magnified. You can see that in Daniel 4, verses 24 and 25, because he mentions the watchers, and they make this decree. And then in verses 24 and 25 there, Yahweh puts his stamp of approval, if you will, and says, yes, let's proceed with this. When the divine council is not functioning perfectly, the watchers hurt people, and the Most High holds them accountable. And you see that in Psalm 82, where he calls these gods, they have their day in court, if you will, and he holds them accountable and says, hey, you're not defending the fatherless and the widows and doing the things that you ought to be doing. So I hope that answers your question, because as monotheists, we are worshipers of one God, but we understand that it's pluralistic in the sense that there are many of these lowercase celestial beings, and even humans sometimes are referred to as God. I believe it was Samuel, who was called up from his abode, being physically dead. And you remember that interaction with King Saul and the witch of Endor. Right. And he has his hoodie on because he's trying not to be noticed. And she says, oh, I see an Elohim coming up from the deepest parts. And it's Samuel. So even in his deceased status on the other side in the unseen realm, he was considered an Elohim. I'll stop rambling.
No, that's perfect. You nailed it. There's two things I want to pull out of what you said. Is the first is the name itself, Watchers. It's kind of a cool title because it gives us some insight into how the purpose of these angels and how they are supposed to relate to us. They're supposed to be essentially our elder siblings. They're supposed to look out for us.
Yeah.
And that's a cool concept that God's got, or the true God Yahweh, he's got these Elohim that are supposed to be looking out for us. They're supposed to be watching out for us. That's why they're called the Watchers. Mm-hmm. It's kind of people debate, are there such a thing as guardian angels? And I don't know, I always say I don't get too specific in how I articulate that, but in a general sense, I think there's kind of something to that they're supposed to look out for us. But then it also, that gives a lot of insight into this rebellion that happened, that there was this rebellion in heaven, a faction of these angels rebel, and then now they're really trying to mess with us and take over us. And it really shows how God views that they are, it's like, well, you're beating up on, it's a family war. It's a family saga. And almost every great saga has a family component to it. And that's really what this is it's a family saga. And we got angels, we got these Elohim that are more powerful than us in many ways, and we got us, and we got God intervening to look out for us. It's such an epic story. And as epic as we're going to get into this more, the antediluvian part of it is really epic, but it gets the most epic is when we actually get to Christ, and he finally says, okay, this rebellion is over. It's done with. And I know I'm getting ahead of myself. So that's one part of it, is the Watchers. But then the other part of it that you mentioned Psalm 82, and I think it's such an important text, because I know there's a lot of people who don't necessarily adhere to that divine council worldview. And I'm not going to necessarily read the text right now. People can look it up on their own time, but it specifically talks about these beings that are referred to, once again, in the English, it's usually these lowercase g gods. And it says that they die like men. And the question I would put forward to the skeptics, or even the people who may be just on the fence a little bit, is, well, how do men die like men? It makes no sense. And
Right.
I think, and I like what you said, how God doesn't need a divine council. And I think he's always intended, everybody is supposed to worship him. There's no intermediaries. The only mediator between God and man is Jesus Christ. But it seems clear to me that God created these angels to help him. I think the word is administer his creation. He's saying, I've just like he's created us with purpose, he's created them with the purpose. And the purpose isn't for them to take worship unto themselves. Their purpose is to help direct themselves and us to worship God.
Yeah.
And it's just clear when you put all these pieces together that there was a plan. It was a good plan. And there are still a group of angels that are staying true to that plan, but there's this other group that have taken it off the rails.
That's really important to note, right? That there are angels, also known as watchers, and again, angel, nothing new to you, Joe. Angel just means like messenger or deputy. It's important to note that some of these have remained faithful, as you've noted, and some have just gone rogue. So we're told to entertain angels because we, can do so, and not even, or entertain strangers rather, and in doing so, we're entertaining angels. Can I mention something on that note real quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thinking about this divine council, remember when the Lord, in a form of a man, not that he was man at that point, because I think the angel of the Lord appearances in the Old Testament, I understand those to be the pre-incarnate Christ. That's how God interacted with his created beings, or his creation. And he looked like a man, but he had two other men with him.
Right.
And so there's these three men that appear at Abram's tent. And as far as he's concerned, in the beginning, they're just three men. And he goes into hospitality mode. He washes their feet. He feeds them. And in the course of conversation, realizes this is Yahweh with his deputies with him. And so Yahweh mentions that Sarah, in her old age, is going to have a son, and she laughs, of course, and he calls her on it, and that's why they name him Isaac, because it means laughter. She's like, I didn't laugh. And he's like, yeah, he did.
Right.
But then as they leave, Yahweh turns to those two beings who are with him, and he says, should we share with Abram what I'm about to do in Sodom and Gomorrah? And he doesn't need to ask permission, This is the creator of the universe. And yet he involves these other beings. These are at least two that are with him. Maybe there are more. I don't know, but there's at least two. And it appears that they said yes, because he began to share with Abram how he was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And then Abram was wrecked because his nephew and his, Lot and his family were there, and he began to plead for his family members. So anyway, that was just one of so many examples in the scriptures where we see God referring to his divine counsel for their advice and perspective.
Yeah. I find the angel's concept, it's just so fascinating because I feel like the Bible in one sense gives us a lot of information about them, but in another sense we know so little about them.
Hmm.
And it's just so interesting to really glean into how God's got it's like we have us and them, and God has plans for both of us, and those plans run parallel to each other, and they even intersect. But when you kind of compare like his plan for us, his plan for them, like both groups have the elect and the people who are in rebellion, and you put it all together, and it just gives you so much insight into what the Lord's doing, and it really paints that picture of that story, that narrative. That's part of the reason why I find it to be so incredibly fascinating.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. In the military, there are so many different levels of classification and access to information. There's secret and there's top secret, and even if you have the highest of secret levels, you don't know everything there is to be known at a secret or top secret level unless you have a need to know. And so you notice that with the God, the Most High God, he doesn't show all of his cards, and he seems content to keep certain information to those who need to know. And for those of us who find out along the way or after the fact, like prophecies better understood after it happens, right?
Right.
But it just blows our minds because it's like, oh, wow, that's what he was up to the whole time. But we have to remember, we often say, the enemy has a vote. And so the enemy's listening too and reading the same texts and scriptures we are and hearing all the prophecies and probably in their own counsel trying to find out what is Yahweh doing and how can we circumvent or prevent that. So, which
Yeah.
they can't.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a perfect segue into our next question here. So we've established that we got this group, Divine Council. We've established that a group goes off the rails, and now we're at the point where this group, the specific subgroup, the Watchers, comes down to the earth and they start interacting with humanity. And we'll get to the kids here in a sec, but one of the things we know they do is that they start sharing their knowledge with humanity. And this is really the beginning of so much of the crazy. It really explains all of our history, and they start sharing what I call the practical sciences, things like metallurgy and mining, and then they start also sharing the esoteric sciences, what we would call magic or witchcraft. The Greek term is pharmakia.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you can just tell us a little bit about this. And the other thing they do is they start to it seems that they start to have themselves be worshiped themselves as those quote gods in rebellion. So maybe you can just further that story a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. This is again, well, this is where I'd like to refer to First Enoch once again, because this is an amazing text. And I'm specifically mentioning First Enoch because second and third, I've mentioned to you before, kind of like the Left Behind series of First Enoch, as far as I'm concerned.
That's a good way to
But
say it.
we know that First Enoch, at least the first 71 chapters, were, they date back to at least 300 BC. At least that's the oldest copies that we have.
Right.
We found in the Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff. So these manuscripts, if you will, they predate the New Testament by 200 to 300 years. And it's in First Enoch that we find that these rogue watchers, as you said, introduced humans to metallurgy and cutting of roots and astronomy, which, well, I'll get into these. For example, the metallurgy. Remember, these creatures are absolutely intelligent, and I don't know how exactly it unfolded. Like, hey, dig over here and you find this stuff, we call it metal. And if you heat it up to this temperature, you can put it in a mold and create, we'll call it a shovel. Hey, there's this other thing you can craft and we'll call it a sword or a spear, so just things turn rather quickly in this knowledge that's passed on to humans. Metallurgy turns to tools, to weapons. Astronomy, it leads to astrology, which, as you said, turns into worshiping the gods or the stars. You have the introduction of beautification, which is interesting because I think, well, what's the matter with eyeshadow? Because that's what's described there in First Enoch. But
Right.
the lipstick and the eyeshadow, I think, kind of led to making women all the more attractive and beautiful, but in a way that I think was more lustful and taking advantage of women.
Right.
And the cutting of roots, which you can get you can get medicines, which thank God we live in a day and age where we do have so many medicinal things that can help us, but we can also abuse these things. We learn like DMT, plants that produce the DMT and things that you just can't cut a root and leave it out in the sun and cut it up into little pills, and all of a sudden you have this psychedelic. There was a process of taking these things and creating them to where you can consume them or smoke them or inject them, and that's what they were doing. Some of these things are still present with us, these psychedelics that enable humans to astroplane and
Right.
go with that silver cord and travel into the non-physical realm. And so the whole point of this is the knowledge that was shared with humans accelerated mankind's wickedness. And it wasn't long after talking about the sons of God, the daughters of men, the Nephilim children, that God says human beings are so incredibly sinful, even not in their imagination, I'm going to destroy them. And then we get the flood. Right. So, yes, humans are bad. But given extra help, we can be more bad,
Right.
That's what happened.
I think this question is so crucial because it seems to me, we obviously don't know all the details of how this played out, but it seems clear to me that there was a relatively primitive society before these beings show up.
Mm-hmm.
And then once they start giving all this knowledge out, and some of it probably wasn't morally evil, some of it was, like you said, but civilization just completely takes off. And it's in Ecclesiastes, there's nothing that will be that hasn't been before. It seems like, yeah, in a lot of ways that's true. We don't know exactly what their technology was, we don't know exactly what it looks like, but it's clear that it takes off. And
yeah
and this is the era in history, all of the civilizations across the world. This is so fascinating to me that they all look back to this time in history. This is the time when the quote gods dwelt with men. It's what the Egyptians call Zep Tepi, the first time. This is, I mean, you look at Greek mythology, I think it would be the story of the Titans. We see it Egyptian, Babylonian, all of these cultures across the world, the Mayans, they talk about this early time when the gods shared their knowledge with humanity. And I think we're seeing that all of that is really the corrupted forms of the pure, true story, which is the biblical story. And it's just so it's so fascinating in that sense. And I think a lot of these buildings around the world, these megalithic buildings, are evidence of it. And even people who are not biblical scholars like Graham Hancock, they've gleaned details of it. They're interpreting it through their worldview. But it just it's this is the foundation for understanding history, is what these beings were doing. It's so important to have that foundation laid.
Yeah, you're so right. It reminds me of when I was a kid and I would ask my parents, Mom or Dad, what does that mean? And they say, well, I'll tell you when you grow up. And it was because if they would have shared that information with me at that age, maybe because I was too young, it might have been inappropriate. It might have done more damage. I mention that because as you keep reading through First Enoch, it appears to me that the knowledge of good and evil, or that tree, would eventually be shared with humans, but at God's own timing. Even in Hebrews, we find that the author of Hebrews says that the mature Christian is the person who has his senses exercised to discern good and evil. So, that's an important thing to point out. And yeah, whatever was shared and however it was shared, it just sped things up and wrecked mankind. So.
Yeah, and I think you made a really good point there, because I mean that's a good question. It's like, well, why did God put this tree, which is he puts it there in the garden, and he specifically tells them not to eat it. And the question is, the logical question is, well, why did he put it there in the first place then? Is he just trying to put a stumbling block in front of him? Is he trying to trip them up? And you answered the question. No, he's not. He fully intended for them to eat it eventually, but at the right time.
Yeah, absolutely. Wasn't it C.S. Lewis that said something to the effect of sin is rooted in the idea that God is holding out something good, and he's keeping something good from you. And that serpent seemed to really play on that. Like, did he really say that? Interesting. Hope this is all going to be in the special features section in eternity, so we can watch it unfold, and the bloopers, keep the deleted scenes out. I don't want to see those.
There was a Blurry Creatures episode. I think it was Doug Van Dorn was the guest, and he said, "When I get to heaven, I want to sign up for the Preflood World history."
Oh
course.
Yeah,
that's me too. I want to be in that class too. It said the former things come to mind. Well, it's like, can it come to mind for a little bit?
Yeah.
I'm obviously saying that tongue in cheek, because I don't think we're going to completely forget everything, but yeah, that's my sentiment too. I'm very curious about all those details that aren't there.
Me too.
Before we move on to the next question, you mentioned the Book of Enoch, and maybe you can I didn't give you this question in your notes, but because I know some people feel really funny about the Book of Enoch, and it's obviously it's not in the Protestant canon. And I personally think it's an extra biblical book. I don't think it's inspired, but I do think that there's a lot of historical truth that is transmitted in that book. So maybe you could just comment upon that real quick before we go to the next question.
Yeah, definitely. So first Enoch, again, there's first and second and third, and they all come from different places and different writers. The first Enoch is man, you kind of wonder if that's from the Enoch that we read about in Genesis, who was so holy, walked with God, and then he was not, because God took him. There's lots of speculation. Some of the early church fathers taught that Noah had a copy, in some format that he brought with him on the ark. I think that's an interesting take, and I hope it's true, because they weren't stupid, and they brought a lot of things with them on that boat. This text, man, it's so, I think it's like the Rosetta Stone, if you will, for that Antediluvian time, and just it explains so much about those watchers and the Nephilim and how we got to where we are. It used to be believed that the writer of Enoch was quoting Jude. When Jude quotes that section, where he talks, God is going to come back with tens of thousands of his angels, his saints, and execute judgment on all the ungodly for the ungodly things that they've done and stuff. But he says something interesting. Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied. So whether the entire text is inspired or not, I'm inclined to think that part there is inspired, in the sense that Jude didn't say that Enoch just said, it said he prophesied. Like, that means God is speaking through him.
Right.
And, Heiser said it doesn't have to be canonical or even inspired to be useful. So at the very least, first Enoch is useful for us. I don't think we need to be scared to read it. When I first read it and then listened to it on Audible, man, I did so very critically, because I thought, man, I want to find something wrong and contrary, so I can just put it away,
right,
and be done with it, and stick with my very safe Christian worldview that I thought I had everything mapped out and packaged tightly, and it was just perfect, until my paradigms were just blown away by this additional information. We can be sure that the Second Temple period people and first century persons were familiar with first Enoch, at least the Book of Giants and the parables. It wasn't like they had to have a Qumran Valley library card and go down to visit the Essenes and then maybe check it out if it was available. Jude was talking about it. Peter was talking about it. Some of the references Jesus makes, you can see that, correlate very seamlessly with First Enoch. So when we found those Dead Sea Scrolls, and we found copies of First Enoch over 300 years older than the New Testament itself, that was significant. That was a significant find, and to find it in the Ethiopian canon, and I think it's also in the Coptic Orthodox canon as well.
I think you're right about that. Yep.
Yeah. So we've got to look at Christendom and the church outside of the Western lens, because depending on where you grew up, you may have a different Bible, and that's just facts. Some of those Bibles have the Apocrypha books in them. Some of them have 151 Psalms. We don't have to be scared of that. I hope that's helpful.
No, very helpful. And I like what you said about us being comfortable. And I know a lot of people feel that way, and I can relate because I felt that way. I feel like I've had to kind of dip my toes into the pool of whether Enoch or the Nephilim or all this stuff kind of gradually. You kind of slowly get more comfortable as the Lord works on you. So I get that. And I think we can invite people to say it's okay to read this stuff without having to think all of it is perfectly accurate to the jot and the tittle. And just to repeat some of the things you said that are really helpful. Yeah, I forget what chapter First Enoch, but Jude verses 14 and 15, that prophecy where Enoch says it's talking about the Lord is going to come back with his saints, and it seems to be pointing forward to even the second coming of Christ.
Yeah,
it's directly pulled from First Enoch, so it's clear to me that that's a real prophecy that has been faithfully transmitted through the ages, and it's in our Bible. And some textual, I'm not an expert in textual criticism, but some guys have tried to say it doesn't actually come from First Enoch, but I think it's very clear that when you look at it objectively, it's essentially a word for word quote. I think there's very little, you can't really get around that. So that clearly says that's one great argument that at the very least, there's some historical veracity to that narrative found in that book. And you also talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls and how the Jewish community at Qumran, which is the group called the Essenes, very, very devout Jewish group. They were very, very strict in their religious observances, that you had to go through a period of being a novice for some years before they really let you in as a full member of the community. They were taking things very seriously. One of the things they were doing is reading, writing, and preserving texts. And we know that because of the Dead Sea Scrolls find at the Book of Enoch, First Enoch was one of those things that they were reading and writing and transcribing, which is a major find. And so all of those historical details say that, just all that in so many words to say, yes, it's okay for us to read it. One more argument I'll give, when the King James translators, they wrote the original 1611, they included the apocryphal books in the publication. They said, we don't think they're inspired. They were Protestant, not Catholic. They didn't believe in but they said they're still helpful historical books. So they said, you can still read them. And that's I think that's the attitude we can have. It's like, even if we don't think everything is inspired, we can still read them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the whole point. Is I'm a big context guy. I mean, I didn't grow up in church, but when I was introduced to the gospel and in reading scripture, I was always taught the importance of context. And for the longest time, context just meant, what is that verse that I'm looking at? What's before that verse and what's after it? That's going to help me understand how to read it in context. Well, that's still true. The other context that is just as important is, what was the context of the people in that time, the original recipients of that letter, of those letters. And so reading things like the Apocrypha books, which are also called the Deuterocanonical, which means the second canon. There's the canon, and then there was the second canon of books that were really, really important to the Jews and to the early church. Enoch was separate from all of that, but was still very highly regarded, and absolutely gives us some insight into what people were thinking in the first century when Jesus came, and quite possibly what they were thinking when they first cracked that scroll open and read Genesis 6.
Yeah, exactly. So that's perfect. That's a good transition. here. And so the next question we finally get to talk about the actual the giants. This is the big dump bum bum. But so we know that the children, so we've talked about how the Watchers, they came down, they interact with humanity, they shared their knowledge, and then one of the things they did is they actually took wives. And earlier you said maybe they did that by force, or maybe they did that through some form of diplomacy, which I kind of lean toward they exchanged that knowledge for the hands of these women in marriage, and they were probably looked like us, human beings, very handsome, very comely in their appearance. And then we get the kids. We get big kids. So what can you tell us about the giants, the Nephilim, the big kids?
Yeah. This is obviously, it's all important, but this is where it's so interesting. The idea, first of all, that these beings that we often just refer to as angels, that they could have some sort of physicality, that just breaks our brains, doesn't it? That they would have parts in order to procreate. That is just disturbing that can happen. So they're made of the stuff of heaven. We're made of the stuff of earth, and they both conjoined and created these bullies, these tyrants, which is precisely what Nephilim means. Some may argue with that, and there's a couple different opinions of what Nephilim means exactly. But from the Hebrew nephil, which means bully or tyrant, the im again just being the plural version of that, it's connected to another Hebrew word called it's nephal, which means to fall, but not like tripping and falling down, but falling in the sense of being so incredibly massive and intimidating that they fall upon people in a very violent way. And so these were more than humans with pituitary gland malfunctions. These folks in Genesis 6:4 are men of renown. The New Living Translation says for Genesis 6:4, heroes and famous warriors. And so the Nephilim, in my mind's eye, the Nephilim were like the X-Men of that day. These are like Marvel Universe type creatures, and they were just insanely intimidating and powerful. Oh my goodness. They're only mentioned, the word Nephilim itself is really only mentioned 3 times in the entirety of the Old Testament. Once in Genesis 6:4, right, where there are giants or Nephilim on the earth in those days, and also afterward. That's a whole other podcast or discussion.
Right.
The second advent of the Nephilim, which is important because we see them after the flood. In Numbers 13, verses 32 and 33, I'll read it. It says, the land through which we have gone as spies. This is after that 12-man reconnaissance mission. Yep. Joshua and Caleb and the guys, and they go into the land. It says it's a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. There we saw the Nephilim, or the giants, depending on which translation you have. The descendants of Enoch came from the Nephilim, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. I used to just read about Goliath, and the impression you get in church is that Goliath was kind of a one-off.
Yeah.
He's just this big person with 6 fingers on each hand, and how long his spear was, and his shield is massive. But he had brothers, and it comes from a clan of giants. And again, this is possibly another conversation to be had. The whole conquest of the Holy Land, the first 5 books of Deuteronomy, involves fighting these massive, giants, creatures, transhuman beings, which is really important to flesh out, for lack of better words, because without that information, the Nephilim being this union, this unsanctioned union between the gods and men, it looks like Yahweh is just flippant about genocide, going and just kill everybody.
Right.
When the laws of warfare are given in the Old Testament, you see that they're allowed to go and fight and kill the men, but spare the women and children and take booty. When it came to the promised land, because it was filled with these Nephilim beings, they were told, or Yahweh told them, to kill the men, the women, the children, the animals. Don't spare anything, because they were just so wicked, and their I dare say their genetic pool was so polluted by their sons of God forefathers. So, did you ask about the emergence of the giants? How they affected humanity?
Maybe I didn't voice the question perfectly. But why don't, yeah, one of the things I was hoping that you could pull out, and I really like, let me just say this real quick, that I really like how you're saying that you don't just see giants in the book of Genesis, it's the whole Old Testament
Oh man, yeah.
narrative. You're saying, hey, they're there in Canaan when the Israelites go in, and you're saying that this explains in large part why God said kill everybody,
Mm-hmm.
because when you don't have that context, everybody's like, oh, God is this evil, genocidal maniac warlord. And, even though we still can question that a little bit with this new perspective, it certainly helps to give a lot of clarity, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's really important. I like what you said. I think we even at one point, we're talking about this on the phone. I said to you, well, yeah, I mean, obviously I knew that Goliath is a giant in the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
but then at some point I went, holy smokes, there's a bunch of giants in the Bible. They're all
Yeah.
over the Bible. As a matter of fact, it's really hard to understand the narrative of scripture without seeing all these giants in the Bible. So all of that is, yeah, very, very important. I'm really glad you brought that out. But yeah, to
Mm-hmm.
backtrack to what you're talking about. So yeah, why don't you just tell us, going back before the flood here, you can tell us about how did these giants show up a little bit? We've already touched upon it a little bit. And then the big question here is, how does this affect the human race in the antediluvian world? Like, how does this affect everything? You got these giants roaming the earth.
Yeah, I mean these giants, man, they are recorded as having an insatiable appetite to the point that they were even eating human beings, and it's clear to me that they felt superior to and hated human beings. So unless ranch dressing was involved or something, which is probably crass to say, it's just the thought of being eaten. It's just gross. And we usually consider ourselves kind of at the top of that food chain there. But to have these other beings that look very human, but bigger than us, we all know what it's like at some point to be child size, to be children, and to look at adults, and to be so impressed with how quick they are. I remember the first time I ever saw my dad run as a kid. I had never seen him run, and we were out for a family walk, and I thought because he was taller than me and older that he was somehow limited in his abilities, and I smarted off and playing around, and when he caught me like that. That's very humbling.
Yeah.
To think that you could, you'd be surrounded by or even called by God to take a land filled of beings of that stature. Incredibly, incredibly intimidating. So, yeah, that's before the flood, and their parents obviously loved them so very much, and I think we'll eventually get into that. What happened to the sons of God, to the angels and washers, but. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about that other than they're not always called by Nephilim. So that Numbers passage, again, I'm kind of getting out of the pre-flood area, but that Numbers passage refers to them as Nephilim. And then later on, we see them called by different names depending on who is interacting with them. For example, I think it was the Moabites that called them the Emim, and the Ammonites, they called them the Zamzumim. And then they were also known as the Zuzim. And then there was Anak, and he had kids, and his giant offspring are called the Anakim.
Yep.
And then you have the Rephaim, the Rapha. And then the Amorites themselves, just an entire race or clan of people they're all giants, man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. it's I got so many thoughts at the same time. I'm gonna have to
me too.
prioritize here. But I think you really nailed it though. Is that so? These giants are birthed to these women, and this is early on in our history. So there's less genetic degradation, and they have kids with these Elohim, which I think that specifically is the part that people get hung up the most. And I understand it because it's like, well, how can a spiritual being, an angel, have kids? And I don't know, but the Bible says so. I guess I don't necessarily mean that in a snarky way, but I think that is more or less the answer.
Keep talking, Joe.
Yep. And the other thing I was going to say is that so these kids, they most likely were birthed as normal babies, and they just kept growing. And at some point, the parents probably were like, "Oh wow," especially the moms. But they become, the thing is, I think one detail of this that's really important to highlight is the fact that they weren't clumsy and oaf-like just because they were big. Yeah. These are big, muscular, athletic, strong warriors, and also highly intelligent.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you have their parents are angels. They're dads, and they have all of that knowledge. So you take the rest of the human race, and you pointed out this hatred and disdain and this looking down, the condescension.
Yeah.
They put all that together, and it's pretty clear that they had this plan to set themselves. That's why they are called the kings and the mighty ones. Their goal was to take over.
Yeah. I think you're really onto something there, because sure, you're familiar with the verse. Psalm 115 verse 16 says, "The heavens, even the heaven of the heavens, belong to Yahweh, but the earth He's given to the sons of men." So the earth is ours. We often talk so much about heaven and how when we die, we hope that we go to heaven. We want to be in heaven. It sounds awesome. At the end of the day, we want to be where Jesus is. And so regardless of our eschatology, it seems to me that we're going to make round trip back to a new heaven and a new earth.
Yeah.
And the enemy from the beginning seems to want to usurp man's authority, God's authority, and then man's authority, and then take over the earth. Even in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, right? If these passages are talking about the serpent or the Satan, he says, "I will be exalted. I will be worshipped like the Most High. I will ascend to the farthest parts of the north." And makes these earthly references. I don't want to. I'm about to go on a rabbit trail, so I'm going to prevent myself from doing that. But
you're making a good point, though, which is God has given us the earth not to abuse it, but to faithfully steward it.
Yes,
faithfully steward it under His under the kingship of Christ. But we have the lease. The title deed has been given to us.
Yeah. Yep.
And they're trying to usurp that. And what's happening here in this story is that we are giving over our humanity, or not our humanity, our dominion to the rebels.
Mm-hmm.
We're handing over the title deed when we're not supposed to.
Yeah.
And it's a Faustian bargain, is that we turn away from what God wanted. We're giving this false authority to these watchers. And you see how God is even judging humanity through this. It's that these guys who get installed as kings, they end up eating us. And I think it's another important detail to remember is this story took place over thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think either of us want to get too bogged down on the dates right now, but we know that it took a long time for this to develop.
Yeah.
From Adam and Eve in the garden to the point where God finally destroys it, there's this period of 1,000 years. And it's clear that as time goes on, it gets worse and worse and worse, until it's, by the end of it, it's this dystopian nightmare, and there's very few humans left.
Yeah. It makes you wonder if that assault was, if that taking the daughters of men, if that was to become human enough, if the sons of God's plan was to create babies who would become men that would be human enough to take the earth. I don't know. It's all conjecture right now, right? I'm speculating, but Paul even refers to the enemy as the god of this world or the god of this age.
Yeah.
And so for God to become man and go to the cross and to disarm the principalities and powers through the cross, triumphing over them in it, it really makes Matthew 28 pop for me when Jesus says, "All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me." And before that knowledge, before that information, I used to think, well, of course, Jesus, you're the Son of God, God in the flesh. Of course, the authority in heaven and earth belongs to you. What are you talking about? But it's like, no, it was given to him. He won that.
Yeah.
On the cross, perfectly living as a perfect man and then perfectly displaying that he is God in the flesh, rising from the dead. Man, this is way more interesting than we ever thought. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought it forward to Christ. I was hoping we'd hit that at some point. I think this is the moment that, I mean, when Jesus, he comes, he lives as a human, he dies on the cross, he conquers death. He's taken the title deed back.
Yeah.
And in a sense, God always had it, but like he's taking it back for us under him. He's taking it away from the rebels. Have been trying to take it, and there's been this tug of war for thousands of years. And and when Jesus gets to the point of his death and his resurrection, he's saying to these rebellious entities, it's officially it's over. I've won, you've lost. Nice try. I don't mean to say it, communicate it flippantly, but that's essentially what Christ is saying.
Yeah, you're right. I think it's Revelation chapter 4. Remember when John sees this scroll that's got those 7 seals on it and no one can open it. And I don't remember if you and I were talking about this, but some describe that scroll as being the title deed of the earth. And there was a brief period in heaven where John notices that no one is capable or worthy, really, of being able to take the scroll and open it. And he weeps. He literally just wept. It was such a sad thing until he saw the lion coming forward as the Lamb of God who was slain before the foundation of the world, and he was able to take it and crack those seals. Man, it really makes sense to me. Reading Hebrews, the author of Hebrews says that Jesus is so much better than Moses and he's so much better than angels. But I think what he means by that is Jesus, the pre-incarnate Christ, really could not have gone to the cross in the form of the angel of the Lord, as a person or being who looked human. That would have been perfect with Gnosticism, if he was some sort of phantom or thing that looked human. But the fact that he was incarnate and became human, that is taking it to a whole other level. Amazing that our God would humble himself so much that he would, as far as I understand it, permanently take on humanity. That just blows my mind. In all of our biology and boogers and weird things that we have going on in this thing, for him to want to be a part of that, to save us, it really is a love story.
Yeah,
it's bigger than us. It's beyond us. It's not even about us in the end. It's something bigger that he's demonstrating.
Yeah, and it's as epic and cool and interesting as all the giants and Nephilims is. The most important part, and also the most heartwarming part, the most intellectually stimulating part, the center part of it is Christ and the gospel. And earlier, we were talking about the divine counsel earlier, and you said God didn't have to. Well, it's the exact same thing. He didn't have to become a man. He didn't have to redeem us. He didn't have to do that. God did it because he wanted to. And that was the plan from the beginning, is that I'm going to redeem these people who don't deserve it. And that's why it's the good news. If Jesus hadn't come, we'd have no hope. If Christianity isn't true, then the nihilists are right. There's no point to any of it. And you might as well just do whatever you want, because what's the point? That's all there is. But fortunately, we have that good news. And like we were talking before, it is a family story, and we see it in the story. The story of the prodigal son is what shows it more than anything else. That we went off the rail. I mean, we were talking about the angels going off the rails. We went off the rails. We do go off the rails. Each of us individually, that's me saying we're all sinners, but we've been redeemed by the God who became a man and suffered all of the hardships of being a man when he didn't have to in order to redeem us. That's the most epic part of it all.
I love that part about our Jesus, King Jesus, that he did become man, and can empathize and sympathize with us. Hey, check this out. In also in First Enoch, and I think part of the backstory, Enoch is appealed to by the sons of God. I don't want a spoiler alert, but they end up getting thrown in jail.
Yeah.
And they plead with Enoch to plead with Yahweh to spare them, to save their lives. And God says, you know what? Here you are asking a man to plead on your behalf, and you should be pleading on behalf of humanity. Very powerful, So what we learn is that there, unless there's some other plan that we don't know of, we're told in Hebrews that God does not give aid to angels. That's in the New King James Version. Other translations say there's no salvation plan for the angels. So it must really burn those who have gone rogue and rebelled, that there's no coming back from that.
Yeah.
And as you noted, he didn't have to save us. The fact he's extended to us a way to be reconciled, redeemed and reconciled to the Creator is phenomenal. So you're really onto something with the parable of the prodigal son, because again, I think we've talked about this offline, but the younger son who goes astray comes back, and the father sees him, runs to him, welcomes him. But then there's the other son, the elder sibling, that says, I've been with you all along, and you've never thrown a party like this for me. And the dad says, yeah, you've been with me all along, but your brother was dead and now he's alive. And I think it was Tim Alberino that first shared this perspective that I've since embraced, that it could be that the Most High, I guess, what am I saying? That elder sibling could be our elder siblings, sons of God.
It could be referring to angels.
Yeah. Yep,
yeah,
absolutely. And if you read the other parables preceding that about the leaving the 99 to find the one, and as opposed to the 99 being the group of just persons who need no repentance. Who needs no repentance? Who are those just persons? Every human needs repentance. So interesting. The woman who loses one of her coins and sweeps the house and finds it. Jesus said that there will be so much rejoicing in heaven with the angels over one sinner who turns. So, yeah, it's kind of encrypted, I think, some of these parables.
Yeah.
Fun to talk about.
Yeah, I think, I first heard that from Timothy Alberino too, how the parable of the prodigal son may be referring to, the angels could be the elder sibling, humanity could be the younger. And I think that's probably true. I'm not too dogmatic on it, but it certainly makes sense, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, if it is that, it's just, that's cool. If not, that's okay too. The parable is still very powerful, and knowing that we have a God who is ready to just leap off the porch and embrace us, and has made a way to do that without violating his role as a judge. It's nice to be embraced by the Father, by God as a Father.
Yeah. And you were also talking about the judgment and Enoch, and that is the next question. Is that so the story, just to recap one more time before we get to the last question, that the angels come down, they interact with humanity, they take wives of the giants, and then as it just goes down, 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 and now we're at the end, and we know that Noah builds the ark and he preaches, and essentially nobody listens to him or repents. But now we're at the point of the judgment and the flood. So what can you tell us about the cataclysm of the flood? And then what can you tell us about the fate of the Watchers and the Nephilim?
Yeah. Great question. And so here we are where the flood happens, and it says in Genesis that everything that lived and breathed on the dry land died, right?
Yeah.
So again, thinking about the Nephilim and the post-flood Nephilim, I wondered, did they build a boat? That would mean they weren't on dry land. Did they go through a portal? Was there some sort of craft that you and I would call a UFO that some went on? I don't know. Again,
Right.
all conjecture, and we're not told exactly. But they knew the flood was coming. What we do also know is that the watchers, sons of God, they went to prison. They went to jail. So the Apostle Peter says in 2 Peter 2:4, he said, the angels who sinned were cast down to hell and were delivered into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment. And I think you know this. Hell was not Sheol, or probably wouldn't have used Sheol anyway. That's more of an Old Testament. That was Hebrew. But Peter could have used Hades or Gehenna, as Jesus and the New Testament writers refer to that abode. But he uses the word Tartarus. And Tartarus, like in Greek mythology, is described as that deep, abysmal dungeon. Really a prison for the Titans, right? The gods who are judged,
Right,
are allegedly in this jail. That's Tartarus. That's where they're at right now, I think, to this day, awaiting judgment. And one of the most horrible things that they had to endure was to witness. I don't know how exactly they could see from Tartarus, but to see their Nephilim sons die in the flood. It must have been torturous. Jude similarly says, the angels who did not keep their proper domain but left their own abode, he's reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. So I can't help but wonder if these are the angels that Paul said that we will judge someday in 1 Corinthians 6:3.
I think so.
Yeah. I'm thinking that Peter and Jude were informed by texts like Enoch. Again, I don't want to put that piece of literature on a pedestal. Again, I think it's all information.
Yeah.
Even the Word of God is useful for a godly life. But can I read to you a certain portion from First Enoch that speaks to this?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is 1 Enoch 19, verses 1 and 2. He says, here shall stand the angels who have connected themselves with women, and their spirits, assuming many different forms, are defiling mankind and shall lead them astray into sacrificing to demons as gods. Here shall they stand. And here he's talking about that jail. Till the day of the great judgment, in which they shall be judged, till they are made an end of. And the women also of the angels who went astray shall become sirens. That last one is a zinger too, because it's like, okay, were there female angels and they went astray? I think most commentators and scholars will say that these were the women who sided with the sons of God. So as the Nephilim died, right?
Yep.
Their spirits were released from their bodies, and that the human women, they had a horrible ending themselves. So as for the Nephilim, they died in the flood. Their disembodied spirits are called demons and unclean spirits. So unclean because they're the unsanctioned blend of gods and humans. I want to quote First Enoch again, Enoch 15, verses 8 through 12. He says, now the giants who are produced from the spirits and the flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling. Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies, because they are born from men and from the holy watchers, is their beginning and primal origin. They shall be evil spirits on the earth, and evil spirits they shall be called. As for the spirits of heaven, in heaven they shall be their dwelling. But as for the spirits of the earth, which were born upon the earth, on the earth shall be their dwelling. And the spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack. They do battle and work destruction on the earth and cause trouble. They take no food, but nevertheless they hunger and thirst and cause offenses. These spirits shall rise up against the children of men and against women, because they have proceeded from them. So, yeah, it's like the Nephilim died or drowned in that flood. They physically died, but then their spirits went around, and those are the ones that we refer to as demons and unclean spirits. Makes sense to me, because I've often thought, why would a very powerful being that, we'll just call them angels, who have the ability to take on physicality, even appearing as men, why would they want to come into another, mortal human being? That never made sense to me. But for these unclean spirits who once had bodies, they hunger, they thirst, they lust, but without bodies, they aren't able to satisfy in any way to quench that thirst, to quench that lust, unless they and I again, I don't know what that looks like. The whole idea of possession and stuff, is it by remote access? Is it physically, spiritually inhabiting another human? I don't know. But they're obsessed with it.
Yeah, I don't know either, but I mean, this is I think so important. This is where it comes up into the modern day. And we can talk about cryptids and the paranormal and demonology, a lot of stuff that's where this channel's been going. And I think this question here at the end it gives you the foundation for understanding it, I suppose, as much as we can understand it, if you want to say it that way. But because I held for a long time the view that demons are fallen angels.
Yeah, me too.
And I think as time has gone on, I mean, I don't think we have to be necessarily too dogmatic, but it makes a lot of sense that these giants their bodies were destroyed, they were killed, and their spirits have remained on the earth as these a pestilence to humanity. And you really see that sense of irony of how God brought about this judgment. He throws the dads, the watchers, down into prison, but then he brings this judgment upon the kids. And for any parent, even a very evil, selfish parent, there's nothing, generally speaking, there's nothing that is going to be a greater judgment than judging the kids. And that's exactly what happens. And the reason why I say that's ironic is because their sin started by producing these kids in the first place. So it's ironic in the sense that God always seems to bring you back to you reap what you sow. And that's exactly what you see that he does. But then you said it perfectly. Why do they want to possess, or some people will use the word demonize? Why do they want to do this? Because, well, they want to hunger, and they hunger, they thirst, they still have these lusts, all of the things that come from the flesh. They still want that, but they don't have a body to act it out anymore. So they're looking for human hosts. And as you pointed out, this is all talked about in the Book of Enoch. And it seems like the worldview, even into the early era of the Christian church, everybody believed that there are fallen angels and there are demons, but they're not necessarily the same thing.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, for the first, as I understand it, for the first 4 centuries, the early church believed this about the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim. And it really wasn't until, Julius Africanus and then Augustine, who really had a lot of traction in the church. And, my assessment is Augustine, who's really contributed a lot of great things to Christianity. He came out of a Gnostic cult, for lack of better words, that really emphasized the spiritual. And I think his hard right, extreme response to that was to kind of sanitize anything that was supernatural and spiritual. And he bought into Africanus' Sethite theory, that the sons of God really weren't angels to human women. It was more, I think it was the sons of Seth, right? Who were more holy and righteous and took human women. But I don't know of any believer who marries an unbeliever and creates mutant babies.
Right.
It doesn't happen, and I don't know. My wife and I are pretty church-going people. We love Jesus, and we don't have perfect kids either. But they're not like they're not X-Men. I'll tell you that. They may be something else, but they're not X-Men. And I love my kids. This is a really interesting thing, and it kind of goes back to what you and I were talking about before we went live, I guess, is the why. Like, why even talk about this? Why is it important? Why is it more than just interesting? And the reality is, if we are fighting, you think about this, Joe, if we are fighting against um, disembodied spirits of the Nephilim to this day, thousands of years after the fact, it's all connected back to that beginning where the sons of God, well, back to the beginning, where the serpent, very craftily so, deceived Eve, got Adam to take that bite, and then began the seed wars. It's all connected. And Jesus' comment about his return, the days of his return would be like the days of Noah.
Yep.
And what was happening in the days of Noah? You had the sons of God who came down. And so these Nephilim beings after the flood, there either was a second incursion, so it happened again, or some speculate that one of Noah's wives had Nephilim genes, or rather, one of his kids' wives, perhaps. I don't know. I'm more of a second incursion kind of guy. But if you were the enemy, Joe, would you do it the way you did it before? You know, would seem very obvious. These large um, men of renown, or would you come in a little bit lower, unsuspectingly? I mean, it's kind of a rhetorical question, but
Yeah.
you know, if it didn't work the first time, why would you repeat that tactic in its exactness? You know, the second time around. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. There's a lot that I don't know. I know the gospel, but
Right.
if the enemy were to do this again in our day and age, it probably wouldn't look the same.
Yeah. And I think I lean more toward the second incursion view. And that would be, it just makes the most sense to me.
Yeah.
I think it ties into a lot of things, which I don't have time to get into, the Tower
Yeah.
of Babel, the
Yep.
Deuteronomy 32 worldview, all that kind of clicks together. But this is what I will say. One thing is that we got a different, it seems like we have, in my mind, a different group of angels on the scene, because the pre-flood ones, as we just said, got chucked down into Tartarus.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems to me that kind of the group of fallen angels under what we call, Lucifer, Satan, well, that's the group operating now. It seems like they really come on the scene in force more so after that first group is thrown into Tartarus. So I think that's one reason. And I think another reason, which may or may not convince people, is, well, Satan's always using the same bag of tricks. So, there's nothing new under the sun. I mean, it seems clear to me that it happened on a far smaller scale, because we
Yeah.
don't get the same type of cataclysm again. But one of the things I want to pull out that you said, which I think is so important, is, and we were talking about this off camera, is the why.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it's important. And one of the reasons why it is relevant is this stuff still is around. It's going on. We don't necessarily always see it with the same intensity as other people in history have, but
Yeah.
all of this stuff that I've talked about with demons, Bigfoot, other cryptids, UFOs, all of this stuff that we lump under these big umbrella categories of cryptids or the paranormal, even though it's not all, quote, directly a demon, it's not all the same thing, it's not all Nephilim, but in one way, shape, or form, all of this stuff goes back to that first time in history in one shape or form or another, whether it's demonic or it's connected to the demonic, or it could be connected in the sense that it goes back to black magic somehow, which goes back to the Watchers. So we don't, even though we're not lumping everything into one category, it is all connected in a roundabout way.
Yeah.
And an illustration I heard that I found really useful is, well, in Tolkien's world, for example, you have elves and dwarves and ents and trolls, and they're all different creatures, but they're all connected in a roundabout way because they're all in Middle Earth.
Yep.
And I think these creatures, all this stuff, the Bigfoots and the giants and the gray aliens, it doesn't mean they're all the same, but there are strings that connect them all together, and it's all relevant. And the thing is that people experience this stuff today. And what I think it's really important for us to emphasize is we are in a spiritual war. And that story of the pre-flood world is so epic because it highlights this battle between humanity, or the faithful remnant of humanity, and this other side that is trying to destroy everything God has created. And we're still in that war right now.
Yeah.
Our king has won the war for us, but the time on the clock has not hit zero yet. The game is, we're still in the fourth quarter here, to use that illustration. And this is why it's so important to talk about this stuff. This is the why, is once people see that the spiritual is real, the good and the bad. There's the bad miracles, the paranormal, the supernatural, and then there's God's miracles, which is far greater. But both sides exist. And once you realize, you're like, oh, wow, the spiritual is real. And you see that the spiritual realm is real and the spiritual battles are real. And you see the players in that war. You see Satan and his angels, and then you see God. Ultimately, you see Christ.
Mm-hmm.
You realize that we are in something far more epic than we've ever realized. You realize we've been created for a purpose. You realize God's got a plan for us, that he wants us to be involved in this battle. And once, I guess what I'm saying is, once that light bulb goes on and you see it, you can never truly unsee it.
Yeah.
And you realize that, we're not just worthless beings created through evolution with no purpose and no meaning, and it's all pointless. That's all gone.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what secular society slams down our throats, that there's no point to it all. And what we're saying is, obviously we need to be humble under God's authority, but there is a point to it all, and we do have meaning, and it is a greater story than we've ever realized. And that's what connects all the dots.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Oh, man.
Long-winded answer, but yeah.
No, that's so good, man. And somehow what you said, it just triggered me. It reminded me of something you said earlier about some of the megalithic structures around the world. And modern archaeologists are towing the party line that humans are relatively new on the scene. And so when you look at Göbekli Tepe and Peru, just the pyramids, that there was just no way, man, that people moved blocks that big. We barely have the technology. In some cases, we don't have the technology now to move stones that big, to put them into place, and or to carve them. There's more. And then the artwork and carvings and stuff that are on these structures around the world are all very similar. So the idea that people were disconnected and there was no Atlantic, or just the ability to move across oceans and stuff until more recent years, it's obviously not true.
Yeah.
But the experts don't want us to. They won't admit that. They want us to believe that we evolved and we're kind of, like you said, purposeless and just goo that took form over a long, long time. Yeah, it's not. There was a technology and a people that seemingly vanished very quickly, and I think that's because of the global flood.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, that's absolutely right. And there is a narrative that's being hidden from the masses, and not every archaeologist or anthropologist or academic is, quote, in on it, but there has been details of this that have been hidden. I mean, the giant mounds that have been dug into, and the institutions like the Smithsonian, now they're gone. There's been hundreds of these mounds in the U.S. dug into, and you're talking about these megalithic structures like Göbekli Tepe, which is potentially what they think 12,000 years old, maybe.
Yeah.
And the megaliths in Peru, Sacsayhuaman, and the ones in Cusco, where it's not just that the how large the blocks are, it's the precision of how they're put together.
Right.
A huge detail, no mortar used, no cement or mortar. That's how we usually link bricks or stones together when we build walls. And these things are fit together so precisely, in many cases, you can't even fit a piece of paper in between these blocks. And it's almost as if it feels as if they were, I'm saying this kind of metaphorically, glued together. And you're like, well, how did they do that with stone chisels and whatever else? And there's people who are not Christians are asking the same questions. And this is why we have the ancient aliens theory. This is why we have, the Grant Hancocks of the world. They're looking at it through their lens. But there's a lot of people who have come to the point and go, man, there's stuff about our history that it just doesn't make sense if you're going through that quote traditional narrative, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, you're right. And that's why I think the scripture is so important, because we have insight. We have at least what God wants us to know in the story that he's telling. And it's not everything there is to be said about human history, but it is informative. And then there are, the other texts, just First Enoch, and there's Jubilees, and man, I think there are about 12 to 14 other texts that are mentioned in the Old Testament that we don't have with us today.
Right.
That, what if those are found tomorrow in a different Dead Sea place, or, just name your location? It would change a lot of things. It would confirm a lot of things too.
Yeah, it would change. It would be a paradigm changer. Well, then maybe that's the correct note to end on. But I know we could go for another hour. Pretty easily.
We could.
But
yeah.
It's been Jason. It's been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed it, and I want to thank you for coming on. This has been a lot of fun.
Thanks for having me and putting up. I was just letting my dog in and out. She was really trying to get my attention, but we prevented an accident by my brief departure from the seat.
No worries. That just shows the audience that it's authentic. So
yeah,
that's all good stuff.
This is a lot of fun. We'll continue to talk offline. I hope. I enjoy your friendship and the time we spend talking about these things, and the fellowship is really sweet to me. So thank you. Hope this is helpful for somebody. Yeah,
I hope so too. Last thing before we sign off, do you want to plug you have your own podcast and YouTube channel? Anything you want to plug that so people can get in touch with what you've done?
Yeah, sure. So I do have a YouTube channel and a podcast that goes by the name Zeal, Stoker, 2 words. That's not my actual name, although I think with Facebook and being disconnected from friends for so long, some people think that my name was actually Zeal Stoker, which is funny at this point. But yeah, it's nothing fancy. It's something that the YouTube channel was really started during the COVID, and when our chapel community very briefly met online, and it was a means to just minister to them. And then even after we came back to chapel, I think it was useful for some folks who were in quarantine. At some point I learned that folks were more inclined to listen than watch, like if they're working out or going for a run or something like that. So I started the podcast. There are a bunch of messages there. Really, it's intended for military audience that I was having the privilege to pastor at that time. So I don't have anything super recent, but you can find it there in Spotify or iTunes, whatever platform you use to listen. But yeah, I hope some folks check it out and are blessed by it. I really would like to start, I think, in First Peter, more of a blurry Bible study, because as you learn things from different perspectives, I'm like, I see things that I haven't really touched on before in previous sermons and stuff that I'm excited to get at. But yeah, that's the long answer. Sorry.
No, that's great. I'll include the links to that in the description so people can just click on it and find it. And for the audience, you and I, Jason, we both enjoy and appreciate the Blurry Creatures podcast.
Yeah,
they've put out a lot of good material. So we're fans of the Blurryverse.
We love Blurry Creatures. Yeah.
So I'm gonna be somewhat shameless and plug my stuff too. So if you want to read more about Nephilim or cryptids or all that stuff, you can check out my book, Apparently the Monsters Are Real, a crash course in cryptids, monsters, and other wacky stuff. And the other thing I want to say is, if you have your own story about giants or demons or aliens, UFOs or Bigfoot, all that stuff, please email our ministry. You'll be emailing me. I would love to hear your story. We're a small team, but we are trying to interact with people on this stuff and give whatever help we can. And so if you are willing to share your story, I will do whatever I can to interact with you, help you talk through that, pray through that. We'd love to hear stories from people who are going through that stuff, because the goal of this ministry is to help people understand this stuff biblically and to help people to work through that. And the goal isn't just to sinfully be curious in dark stuff, but to help people cleanse darkness out of their lives. That's really the goal. So, yep. So this has been Jason Owen and Joe Harper here with another edition of Reformed Truth Through Ministries. Jason, thanks again for coming on.
Thanks, Joe. Blessings.
All right, everybody, we are signing off. God bless everybody and have a great rest of your day. This is Joe Harper with Reformed Truth Through Ministries. If you enjoyed this video, then check out our website at www.reformedtruther.com.